Alright, I think I just picked myself up another project sword. Let me explain, and I'll try not to ramble too much, but quick flashback, if you've been following my channel, you know I've spent the last couple of years exploring HEMA for the first time in my life, but then comparing that to my much longer studies and experience with Chinese and Japanese swordsmanship. Also, if you've been following my channel, you notice Mike is developing a strong preference for cut and thrust swords, and lately one-handed, straight-bladed cut and thrust swords. So you've seen me pick up some arming swords and some side swords and some basket hilts and some rapiers and even a Scabbard, and most recently a couple of Viking era swords, which I didn't think I would like the grip shape and the weight and the balance and things like that, but it turns out I really do. And again, these are swords that are familiar to me from my time with a Chinese Jin. So I've been thinking for a while about a sword that's kind of between that Viking era design and maybe an arming sword. And what tends to come up would be referred to as, in many cases, Norman style swords. And one sword I had my eye on for the longest time was the cold steel Norman. And has it lived up to expectations? Now, this isn't an unboxing. I just got it the other day, spent a little time with it, so I want to give you my initial impressions, what I like about it, what I don't like so much, what I'm not so crazy about, and what thoughts I might have on where I might go in terms of making some improvements. So let's get into it. All right, let's start with the out-of-the-box edge, shall we? Do the other one. All right, let's talk about why I bought this particular sword and why I had my eye out for it for a long time. I was beginning to think my search was cursed. But you guys know how the markets have been in 2020, 2021, where everything's been out of stock forever. Well, a few months ago, this came up for sale on Amazon, one in stock. So I figured I'd better jump on it when it was there. But that was the night the tornado hit their distribution facility, and then my sword promptly disappeared from the planet. And it took them about 6 weeks to admit that my sword had disappeared from the planet and get me my refund. And by then, short attention span, I'd moved on. But I kind of, kept cornering my eye out to see when it came back in stock. Recently did, for a little bit cheaper. Ordered it and got here pretty quick. So yay, but did it live up to those expectations? Well, what were those expectations? 3 things put a target on this sword for me: the specs, the design, and yes, the country of origin as well. Now, if you're familiar with cold steel swords, you know that they tend to source their swords from either India or China. Now, the India-made swords, I have several examples, they remind me very, very, very much of windlass-made swords. So they tend to be very robust and overbuilt, not necessarily with a lot of distal taper, if any at all, so they tend to be kind of heavy in the blade. And any edge that's on it tends to be, well, an afterthought. Very steep secondary grind that barely functions, so usually what I have to do with those is spend a lot of time reprofiling that blade out. But once I've done that, it gives me a sword that's a pretty good cutter, but very, very tough. Not afraid to put it through hard use and abuse, including some of my experiments with steel on steel. So that's the upside of the India-made swords. The Chinese-made swords, like my long sword, my hand and a half, and yes, also my Scabbard, different story. Now, they use the same steels. Cold steel loves 1055 high carbon steel. And it's a steel that holds up to, again, use and abuse, as far as I've seen, and holds a functional edge. It's not going to be a razor-sharp, hard knife edge, but that's not what you want on a sword. Some of their swords come with a higher carbon. You watch what the description is. And some of their swords come up to, 1090. But this is the 1055, so I don't have any worries about it being a 1055. I think it'll be just fine. But shape of the blade, big difference. Very flat planes, crisp lines. It's very well done. That full-length fuller is very even on both sides and very well shaped. and then those edge planes taper straight down to the edge with no secondary grind. It comes out of the box with a really sharp edge, all the way down, both sides. Now, it is a very burry, very rough, ragged edge, and you saw it cut paper just fine, but it was a little bit rippy. However, it doesn't take much to put a really keen edge on here. Just clean that up, hone that up a little bit. However, because it is such a fine edge, I worry about it taking damage, like a reproduction Japanese style sword. I'm not going to use it against hard targets, certainly not going to put it against steel on steel. So, good for cutting soft to medium targets, but I got to be a little careful with it. I don't think the sword's actually going to like break or bend very easily, but I expect that edge would be fairly easy to nick up. So, the give and take. They also tend to have distal taper, at least a reasonable amount, a couple of millimeters worth. But let's talk about the specs, because that really caught my eye too. I've gotten really used to a sword in this particular size and shape. So you're talking about a 30.5-inch blade. That's 2 inches wide at the base. It is a diamond cross section where you can see it. Now, the interesting thing about this particular sword is I've seen what look like two different models. In one, the fuller goes down through the guard, which is a very common design. This one, you'll see it stops about 3/4 of an inch up above the guard, which is visually kind of interesting. Not sure if I like that or not yet. We'll see. But it also has an interesting function when it comes to sheathing the blade, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But moving on. 4.5-inch grip. Weight. Well, the websites, I think it was a typo because it said 2 pounds, 0.5 ounces. No, I think there's some extra digits and things in there. 2 pounds, 5 ounces on mine, which puts it's a pretty comfortable weight for me for a one-handed sword. However, despite the distal taper, I think a lot of it's the width of the blade and the lack of necessarily a whole lot of profile taper. Balance point on this one is at 4 3/4 inches, which is just a little blade forward for me. Now, not as much as that Beowulf Viking era sword I picked up where the point of balance is at 6 inches. That's a really blade forward, blade present weapon. But I think this one overall is a pretty good give and take, and we'll take a look at handling in a second. But yeah, 4 3/4 inches from the guard is where the balance point is. Let's talk about the friendly end, which gets us back to design. Yes, it is kind of in that arming sword range with a little bit of a hint of that Viking era or post-Viking era influence. So, the guard is swept forward. Now, I certainly have learned to work with a straight cross guard without it digging into me, but I kind of like them a little swept forward stylistically and comfort-wise. But really sharp edges on this guard. So anytime my hand does get close to it, I definitely feel it, and it is not comfortable. I'll probably have to round that off. And also, while I'm at it, just like my Italian longsword, my 1.5, the polish job. The blade's nice. Nice satin kind of a finish. Very nice finish on the blade. But the fittings, yeah, shiny and chrome. Witness me. Yeah, it's a little too much. Too much of a hood ornament. I realize there's probably some people in my audience who don't know what a hood ornament is, but we'll just go with shiny and chrome. Doesn't quite look. And it's not going for like a historic reproduction, but something functional that's kind of shaped like a historic sword. But yeah, I'm probably going to have to do something about that. Which gets us to the pommel. They call this a cocked hat pommel. So it's not quite something like a wheel pommel or something like that, nor is it Viking era pommel. Now, I've learned how to work with those Viking era pommels. I didn't think I'd like them, but I've learned how to kind of lock my hand in there. This one, of course, is a lot more friendly because it is curved back, swept back, and rounded around the sides. It's got some edges on it, so I may or may not do anything about that while I'm dealing with the finish and other touch-ups. But it's got this conical shape that they call the cocked hat. And on the website for Cold Steel, they say this could be an impact weapon. And I'm thinking probably not, because this is a threaded construction. Now, I haven't taken it apart, but if it's like other Cold Steel swords with threaded constructions, Wood core handle, then you've probably got a washer and a big old hex nut under here, and then pommel goes on, and then this is a sleeve nut. I wouldn't want to hammer on anything with a sleeve nut. It would probably break pretty quickly. And then I'd need some other way of securing my pommel. So, yeah. But everything's nice and tight. However, the grip has the same issue that I've had with the cold steel longsword and hand and a half. Wood core has a nice shape to it. It's nicely oval with a little bit of a palm swell, so that's comfortable. But this leather covering they put on it, stitched on the side, it's an even stitching, but it is kind of raised and a little bit, I guess I would call it sharp. Now, my Ronin katana Euro style swords have pretty significant stitch ribs on the side, but I've learned how to burnish those down, round them off, work with them so they actually help me index the sword. This doesn't feel comfortable or confident on my finger side like those do. So I roll it around and put it on my palm side, and still it's just kind of off-putting. But what's really off-putting is the leather they use is a really soft, kind of spongy, like a calf skin, and it makes me feel like I'm wearing a glove when I'm not wearing a glove, is how I describe it. It feels, it's not really shifting around, but it feels like it is. It doesn't feel sure and solid in my grip. So I might have to do something about that. So, mixed bag. Let's talk about handling, my overall initial impressions of it, and what I think I may or may not have to do with it. All right, before I get up and move the camera, we have to talk about the sheath. Now, the sheath is, well, it's kind of that, again, Chinese-sourced cold steel sheath in many ways, and it's got a lot going for it, and one thing really not going for it, but potential. And we're going to start using that word potential quite a bit. So, you've got a steel shape that has some nice texturing here around the trim, which is then matched with the throat. And they're pretty thick cast pieces. Shiny, but I don't think they're quite as garishly out of place looking as, say, the guard is in terms of shiny and chrome. Leather covered, seam on one side, which it feels a lot like the grip, which on a scabbard is not bad, but on a sword grip, I wouldn't want it. Wood core. Now here's where things go a little bit funky. The wood core does extend through the mouth of the metal, which protects the sword from rubbing against the metal. But if you look at it, you'll notice it's very uneven. There's one side that looks absolutely detached. Now here's where it becomes a problem, but possibly something I could work with. The shape of the blade, specifically here, okay? Because of that wide fuller, the blade tends to be really kind of, I guess you'd say, thin and flat where it's fullered, but then all of a sudden right here it widens out. About 1.5 millimeters, I would say. Now think about where this is and how long it is. It kind of reminds me functionally when it goes into the scabbard of what a habaki does on a Japanese style sword in terms of locking that sword into a wooden sheath, wooden scabbard, saya, and also sealing it. But because this one I don't think was shaped for it, that's a very flat slot, right? So what happens is, and this came shipped to me with the blade and the scabbard wrapped separately, is there's some drag in here. That's probably where, again, that tip is a little bit wider than the rest of the sword too. I can kind of feel that drag. But when I get to here, and that's that. Unless I pound it in, and then I'll have to pound it back out again. Yeah, it don't fit. So I'm probably going to have to go in there and reshape that. But I think once I do, it's going to give me a scabbard that's got a really, really snug fit. But it's going to need some work. But potential. All right, expectations versus my initial impressions. Expectations based on listed specs of this sword weighing 2 pounds, half an ounce, and 2 pounds, 5 ounces. I was expecting a sword that would be really light and very handy, very maneuverable. Something that might even appeal to my daughter, who likes lighter swords. I mean, she ran off with my Windlass Marauder, has her eye on my Cold Steel Kalish Mard, but my Kingston Arms Type 14, which weighs 2 pounds 2 ounces, she doesn't like that one, possibly because, well, the weight's a bit forward, and that skinny grip, sometimes I have a hard time hanging on to it. So I might have to do something about that, and we will revisit that sword maybe in the future. But as for this one, well, all right, I don't think 2 pounds 5 ounces is heavy at all, doesn't feel heavy at all. I think the feel, the weight, my ability to move it around even without a brace on, yeah, you can hear some sword wind there, right? Just, I just picked this thing up the other day, yesterday in fact, as I'm filming. So yeah, I can move it. It responds. It's reasonably quick, yet still has a reasonable amount of presence. But I think my biggest issue is that spongy grip, which gives me, well, terrible feel. I almost feel, it's going to sound a little weird, I feel like I've got a little bit of response delay. When I go to move the sword, it's almost like the sword is lagging behind what I'm doing with my hand, as if I had a sponge wrapped around the grip. If that makes any sense, even though it's really thin. Now, my Cold Steel Longsword and Hand-and-a-Half sword have the same issue, but I've got 2 hands on those weapons, and that compensates for that a lot. Having just my one hand, whichever hand, on this weapon, it's just, well, listen to this. You can hear it's tacky. It's not going to slip out of my grip. That's not the issue. And the leather isn't moving. It's just soft enough that I don't feel the blade, and especially I don't feel the tip. So far as I'm going to thrust, it's really hard for me to find where that tip is. Now, that may change with practice. We'll see, and I'll get back to you, but I think one of the first things I'm definitely going to have to do is reconsider the grip covering. Let's compare it to a couple of similar swords that I have. Now, Ronin Katana's Beowulf, okay? If you look at these from, well, your camera perspective, the blades look very similar in shape and size, but 2 pounds 5 ounces versus 2 pounds 12 with a 6.5 inch point of balance. Yeah, this just is a cleaving beast, and it's a heck of a workout. I'm enjoying it, and actually, the only thing I mentioned I was going to do some modifications. I did round the edges of that pommel just very slightly, but I'm really getting used to that pommel shape and starting to like it. It is a great PT tool, but it's got me back in my brace more than I thought I'd be, so I'm not going to swing this around very much. But even with the weight, this style of grip, that cord covered in leather, even with the seam, it just feels so much more solid and positive for me than this thing. I mean, this one can't really hear much tackiness to it compared to a couple of other ones. My favorite, still my favorite arming sword, is the Ronin Katana Italian. And this also serves as a hand-and-a-half sword because there's enough real estate on that grip, especially with the fishtail pommel. I can get a second hand on there if I want to, but let's talk about weight. This is 2 pounds 10 ounces, so it is 5 ounces heavier than this. But because the point of balance is just a little closer to the hand, it's interesting that side by side, weight-wise, these two feel very similar. But again, that grip for me is a lot more positive, and because of the balance and the grip, I feel like I've got a lot more awareness of the blade and the tip. So this one just still continues to feel really, really good. This one feels like it's kind of, well, absent, I guess would be a great description for it. Let's talk about the Ronin Katana Type 12. Again, similar size blade, 2 pounds 12 ounces. So heavier, point of balance reasonably far forward. So this has got a lot of presence in the blade. Not as much as the Beowulf, but yeah, there's a huge difference between these two swords. This, even with its extra weight and mass, which of course creates some issues with moving it around based on inertia, I've really kind of gotten used to it and like it. It is, it's good exercise. But yeah, I've really gotten a good sense of the blade and the tip with this sword versus this, where it's just. Let's also take a look at flex. This one, yeah, it's not floppy. It's a little bit bendier than my other swords, but you'll notice it's an even flex through the whole blade, despite the fact that it does have some distal taper. I think a lot of that's because of, it's got a full-length fuller. But so does my Type 12, right? And look at the flex on that. A lot less, and it's more towards the tip. Okay. So Ronin Katana wins that round. I don't know. I'm going to have to do a little work on this. I haven't taken it out cutting. I haven't spent more than a day with it yet. So we'll see how it goes. Obviously, I'm going to need to fix that scabbard because it's totally not working right now. I'm going to hone this edge just a little bit, just clean it up, take it out, do some cutting when time and weather allows. I am probably going to take some sharp edges off the guard, maybe take some of that shiny chrome looking finish down to something that's a little bit more sedate, maybe do the same thing to the pommel. But yeah, I'm going to have to rethink this somehow. So, to be continued. Until then, let's get our conversation going. If you've got this sword or something similar, speaking of similar, another sword in this, line, vein, whatever you want to call it, that I considered was Cold Steel's Viking sword. And I'll post a picture. But I haven't seen many reviews of this one. I've seen more reviews of the Cold Steel Viking sword, and they're kind of mixed. People either love it or they're meh. Based on how I feel about this one, I'm not eager to run out and get that Viking sword. If you happen to have it, tell me about it. Give me some recommendations. But obviously I'm feeling like it's going to have the same grip cover issue, which is going to need to be dealt with. And I don't know what, but it is also a made in China cold steel sword and everything that goes with that distinction. So probably has a lot of potential, but if you have it, let me know. If you have any other Viking swords or arming swords or anything in this vein that you like or you hate, let me know about those too. I value our conversations more than I can tell you. So let's keep that going. But until next time, as usual, thanks for watching, following, liking, subscribing, and I do hope to see you back for, wherever this goes.